Hey everyone, and welcome to lesson 1 of the basics of data visualization with R for ecologists. I'm really excited to get started, so let's go right in. We're going to cover the very basics of creating data visualizations using the base R package, and that's the package that comes pre-installed with R. If you've already taken my Basics of R for Ecologists course and feel confident with the basics, then you might want to skip this module, but either way, I think it should offer a good refresher. So first, let's go ahead and load the data. Now for this course, we're going to be using mostly built-in data, using the data function to access a variety of different data sets that come built in with R, and that's just to make things a bit easier so we can get right to visualization. So first, we're going to load this data set called plant growth. And so when we run this line of code, we get this thing that pops up here in the environment. It says promise when we click on it, or whenever we use this plant growth data frame, then this gets converted into the data frame that it is. And so let's take a look at what these data look like. So if we scroll up here in the console, we can see that we have one column for weight and one column called group. And so in this case, for these data, we have a total of 30 data points, and weight represents the dry biomass of each plant in grams after it's been collected and dried, of course. So if we do table plant growth and run that, actually we want to do a table of all the different groups. We can see that we have 10 different plants for each of these treatments. But let's say that it turns out that we have another column in this data set on the amount of water that each plant has received throughout its life in liters. So here are the data. They're already in this file, so you don't have to enter them yourself. And we're just going to add that to this vector of water, and then add that vector of water as a new column to the plant growth data set. So great, now we have these 3 columns to work with. So now for your first plot, let's create a scatter plot to see how plant weight varies as a function of how much water the plants received. And to do that, all you have to use is the plot function. And the first argument is the x. In this case, we're going to do plant growth. And remember, the $sign is used to select particular columns. So in this case, water. So if we were to run just this, we get the vector of water values. So that's going to be the x-axis. The y-axis is going to be the data frame plant growth, but this time we're going to select weight. So now we can see this vector of weights. So when we run this, and there you go. We get a scatter plot with plant weight on the y-axis as we defined it here, and plant water, or excuse me, the amount of water that was given to each plant on the x-axis here, and we get this scatter plot. So congrats, this is your first plot, and you can make this plot smaller or larger by resizing this window. That's the great thing about RStudio, is it just has all this built-in functionality to help you visualize and work with data in this way. All right, but there's some other ways in which we can use the plot function. We created this plot using the plot function and specifying the x and the y axis. But there is another way to use the plot function that is a bit of a better practice, and it's easier to specify the x and the y axes by saying y is a function of x, or y and then this tilde symbol, which is underneath your escape key. Usually you have to hold shift down and then press it. It's this horizontal squiggly line. I think it's called a tilde or a tilde or something like that. Either way, in R it represents is a function of. So you can, whenever you see that tilde, you can read it as is a function of. So in this case, y is a function of x. And so here we can say the weight of each plant is the y-axis. So the weight of each plant is a function of the amount of water that it received. So to use this with the plot function, all we have to do is plot plant growth weight. So here, notice we're reversing these because we're doing the y first. Is a function of plant. And as I'm typing it, you'll see this pops up. So you can just click that to make it a little faster. So plant weight is a function of the amount of water that it received. And so if we run this, you'll see that nothing changes here, and that's just because it plotted the exact same thing over again. It's just another way of using the plot function. But this type of notation is really helpful because we can actually add an argument to this function to indicate where the data come from. So instead of having to continuously write plant growth here, we can just modify this by saying weight is a function of water, and then add an argument for data. So data equals plant growth. So now if we run this again, you'll see that almost nothing changes here, except now the x and the y axes are just the name of the variable. Instead of this, if we click on this arrow here, we can go to the previous plot we had. Instead of having plant growth $weight, we just have weight because that's the name of the column, and it knows where to get those data from because we added in this data argument, data equals plant growth. Great, so that's it for this intro lesson. Quick summary, we loaded our data, added another column to the data set, plotted a very simple scatter plot using the plot function, and I showed you a neater way of using the plot function by saying the y-axis is a function of the x-axis and then adding in the data argument. In the next few lessons, we're going to go over a bit more about how to plot the two most common types of plots in ecology using R's built-in base package, and then later we'll move on to a more advanced plotting system. But for now, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed this, and see you in the next lesson.